My name is Carol. I'm 22, fresh out of college, and ready to begin the next chapter of my life. But before I share what happened recently, I need to give you some context. It all starts with a house. My mother's house, to be exact. She passed away 4 years ago, and it was her legacy that became my burden. Growing up, the house was always home. My mom bought it before she even met my dad, and it was always just ours. It wasn't much, but it was everything to me. My mom always kept everything organized. I'd often hear her humming while she worked on the garden, or organizing the small bits of clutter around the house. I knew that when she passed, the house would be left to me, and it always felt like something that would be permanent in my life. She made sure I knew about the will too, telling me, "This way, you'll always have a home, no matter what." But life has a way of complicating things. I was only 9 years old when my dad left us. No big fight, no custody battle. He just packed his bags one day and left, choosing a new life with another woman. I wasn't really included in that new family of his. His wife, Linda, had their daughter, Sophie, not long after, and I would visit their house sometimes, but it never felt right. It was like I was an outsider, and they were living a life I was no longer a part of. Still, I kept up the routine of sending birthday cards, saying happy holidays, and attending the occasional dinner with them, but it was always awkward. My mom worked hard as a senior accountant, and when cancer hit, she put everything on hold. I was 14 when she was diagnosed, and she spent 4 long years fighting the disease. She never complained. She just kept pushing, making sure I was okay while she fought for her life. But cancer doesn't care about plans or promises. It took her when I was 18, just weeks before I was about to leave for college. It felt like the ground had been ripped from under me. In those first few weeks after her passing, my dad stepped up in a way I didn't expect. He offered support, along with Linda and Sophie, to help me cope with my loss. I was too numb to question it, too lost in my grief to care that much. I didn't want to be alone, so I accepted their help without truly thinking about it. Things settled down, and my dad suggested that they move into the house while I went off to college. "We'll keep things running for you," he said one morning over breakfast. "You can focus on school, and we'll take care of everything here." At the time, it made sense. I was going to be gone for 4 years, and I didn't want to leave the house sitting empty. So I agreed. Linda, who had been distant at first, started acting kinder to me. Sophie, my half-sister, who was 10 years younger, began treating me like an actual sister. I convinced myself it could work. The next 4 years weren't perfect, but they weren't bad either. When I came home for the holidays, things felt okay. Linda would cook big meals, making me feel like I was part of a real family. Sophie would show me her latest artwork or talk about what was happening in her life. We even spent Christmas together, decorating the tree and having those small, pleasant moments. I could almost forget that this wasn't the family I grew up with, that things had changed, and that I wasn't part of my dad's new life. It was a strange family dynamic, but it worked. During those years, I kept in regular touch with Dad. I called him weekly to update him on my classes, and we would talk about Sophie and Linda. Sometimes it felt like things were going smoothly. Linda even invited me to her book club, where we would laugh and chat about books. For the first time in a while, I thought maybe this strange new family of mine wasn't so bad. We weren't perfect, but we were functioning. By the time I graduated, things seemed to have settled into a rhythm. I had accepted a job offer back home at a financial firm. Everything felt like it was falling into place. The pieces were finally coming together. I was excited to return home, start my career, and reclaim my space in the house that had once been mine. I had lived through the grief, and I had fought through the emotional wreckage to make it here. It was going to be my time now. But when I returned home that sunny June afternoon, everything changed. I had just graduated and was ready to move forward. I was expecting to walk into the house, put my bags down, and settle back into my old life. But when I tried to unlock the door with my keys, it didn't work. The key wouldn't fit. I thought I must have been tired from my trip, so I tried again. Still nothing. My heart sank, and I knocked on the door, confused. Linda opened it, looking surprised. Her hands were covered in flour, like she had been baking. I could see Sophie and Dad in the living room. The unease in the air was palpable, but I pushed it down and tried to stay calm. "What's going on?" I asked. "Why was the lock changed?" "This is my house." Linda looked uncomfortable. She was quiet for a moment before replying. "We weren't expecting you," she said. her tone cautious. "You should have let us know." I stared at her, at Dad, who was sitting there in his favorite chair, and at Sophie, who was staring at the scene unfolding. "I'm home," I said, confused. "I've got a job here. I told you I was coming back." Dad suddenly stood up. "Can we talk, Carol?" he asked, his voice low. His eyes were avoiding mine, and there was an awkward tension in his voice. That was when I started to feel something wasn't right. Something was off. But I followed him into the office, Mom's office, and waited for him to speak. When he finally did, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. "Carol," he began, "the house actually belongs to me." He didn't meet my eyes, and I felt my stomach drop. "I gave it to your mom after the divorce, but after she passed, it reverted back to me. Linda doesn't understand that." It felt like the ground was shifting under me. The house I had thought was mine wasn't mine at all. It was Dad's, and I had been living under false pretenses. My heart raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "I need time," Dad said, looking at me with pleading eyes. "I'll make it right. I promise. Just give me a little time." But how could I give him time? How could I trust someone who had kept such an important truth from me? As I stood there, trying to understand what was happening, I realized that this was no longer my home, and soon I would be forced to make a decision. But the hardest part was yet to come. The days that followed were a blur of tension. That night at dinner, the atmosphere was thick with something unspoken. Linda kept shooting me these sidelong glances across the table, her face tight, her eyes calculating. It wasn't the warmth I remembered. It was the chill of a stranger who had just realized that she wasn't welcome in the very space she had come to claim. "More potatoes, anyone?" Sophie asked brightly, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Her question was innocent enough, but it felt out of place in the room that was suddenly filled with silence. She turned to me, eyes wide, clearly not understanding why the air felt so heavy. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just sat there, stabbing at my peas, trying to keep my composure, trying to ignore the fact that everything I thought I knew about my home, my family, was beginning to fall apart. Linda's voice broke through the awkwardness. "You know," she started, not looking at me but instead focusing on her plate, "I've been thinking about the living room. The furniture arrangement seems a bit outdated. I think we could give it a little refresh, make it more modern." The way she said modern sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a comment about furniture. It was about erasing every trace of my mother. The way she always made the place feel cozy and lived in, her favorite vase on the mantel, the books on the shelves that had been there long before Linda stepped foot in the house. Every little thing that made this place ours was now up for debate, for change, for disposal. Dad coughed awkwardly, his eyes darting from Linda to me, clearly sensing the tension building. "Let's talk about something else," he muttered, trying to steer the conversation away from the growing discomfort. But the words were already out there. I could feel the walls closing in around me. The house was no longer mine, and I wasn't welcome in it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I had already learned that doing so would only make things worse. Instead, I sat in silence, watching as they continued to pretend everything was fine, as if I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. The next few days were a struggle to maintain normalcy. I woke up each morning, walked into the kitchen, and tried to pretend that things weren't completely different. But they were. Linda's passive-aggressive behavior became more pronounced. She'd do little things like wash my clothes with colors that bled or make enough food for 3 people, acting surprised when I came to the table. If I tried to make myself breakfast in the kitchen, she would suddenly need to reorganize the cabinets. The space, which had once felt like mine, now felt cold and uninviting. It was as if she was systematically taking over every part of it, from the furniture to the food to the very air I breathed. Sophie, too, had changed. The sweet, attentive half-sister who had once called me for advice and sent me memes was now rolling her eyes when I entered the room. She started calling me that girl when talking to her friends on the phone, loud enough for me to hear. The connection we had built over the years seemed to vanish overnight, replaced by this strange hostility that I couldn't quite understand. The tension at home was unbearable, and all I could do was keep my distance. My professional life, at least, was going well. I had a job lined up at Marshall & Brooks Financial. I had received a warm welcome when I visited, and my new colleagues, like Sarah from the risk assessment team, were friendly and eager to help. I started feeling like maybe I was moving forward, finally escaping the oppressive weight of what had become my home life. But coming home was always uncomfortable. I would walk in after work to find hushed conversations or papers hastily shoved into drawers whenever I entered a room. Linda and Dad would separate quickly, and fake smiles would appear on their faces as if nothing had changed. But I could see it. I could feel the cracks. Then came the morning that everything changed. It was a quiet Saturday, the house eerily still. No sound of Linda's usual weekend meal prep in the kitchen. No music blasting from Sophie's room. No sports game on in the living room. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. My heart began to race as I checked every room in the house. The kitchen was spotless, unused. The living room was empty, save for a few pillows perfectly arranged on the couch. Even Sophie's boots, which were usually strewn about by the front door, were missing. I checked my phone. No messages. No note about where anyone had gone. Panic started to set in, but I pushed it down and tried to stay rational. Maybe they had gone out for breakfast. No, that didn't make sense. They never went out for breakfast without at least leaving a note. I called Dad first. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again, then again, but the result was always the same. I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in my stomach. I needed answers. Finally, I called Linda. She picked up after the fourth ring, and I could immediately tell something was off. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice cold, sharp. It wasn't the tone she used with me before. "Where is everyone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause before she answered, and when she did, it was like a switch had flipped in her. "Oh, didn't we tell you?" She laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "We're in the Maldives, first-class flights, luxury resorts, the works. We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you tagging along and expecting us to pay for you too." The words stung, but it wasn't just the insult. It was the casual cruelty behind them. She wasn't even trying to pretend that she cared. "Not that you'd know anything about paying for things yourself," she added, her tone dripping with disdain. I felt my stomach turn. I had been left out of this vacation without so much as a second thought. My own father and his wife, both of them so casually dismissive of me, had chosen a luxury getaway over even the smallest consideration of what I was going through. Her voice cut through again, more venomous this time. "You're nothing but a lazy freeloader living in our house like you own it. Your father might put up with it, but I'm done." My heart pounded in my chest. They were in my house. The house my mother had worked for. The house she left to me. And now they were going to throw me out. "Did you think you could live here forever?" she continued, the venom in her words unmistakable. "Living off us while we work hard to maintain this home. You're not our problem anymore." Her words crashed over me like a wave, but I wasn't ready to drown. I wasn't going to let them treat me like this anymore. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling with anger. This was my home, my mother's home, and I was done being treated like I didn't belong. I was done being invisible in the place that should have been my sanctuary. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The reality of what Linda had said echoed in my mind as I sank into the kitchen chair. The house was quiet now, eerily quiet. I could still hear her voice in my head, the venom, the condescension, and the way she had so easily discarded me, as if I wasn't even worth the effort to pretend anymore. The house that my mother had worked so hard for, had made sure would always be my home, was now a battleground. It was more than just the material space. It was the legacy of my mother, the memories of our time together, and it was being tainted, stolen, as if it had never mattered. I felt a sickening wave of anger and betrayal wash over me, but this time, something shifted inside me. I wasn't going to let this happen. I wasn't going to let Linda or my father, who had spent too many years avoiding responsibility, take what was mine. I had spent too long letting other people control the narrative of my life. The narrative was mine now, and I wasn't going to back down. I took a deep breath and grabbed my phone, dialing the number of a locksmith I had found online earlier in the day, just in case. The locksmith agreed to come over right away. As I waited, I began to gather everything they had left behind, everything that didn't belong here. Linda's expensive clothes, Sophie's schoolwork, Dad's golf clubs, all of it. They had been so comfortable in my home, as though it were their own, as though I was the unwelcome guest. It was time for that to end. By the time the locksmith arrived, I had packed their things into boxes, neatly and efficiently. Everything that they had left in my house, in my life, was now in the garage, waiting to be taken away. The locksmith worked quickly, replacing the locks on all the doors, changing the very access they had to my life. It cost me a small fortune, but I didn't care. It was worth every penny. This was the first step in taking back control. When he finished, I handed him my credit card and felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The new keys felt heavy in my hand, but in a good way. It was as if I were holding the power to finally start over, to stop being the pawn in someone else's game. I walked back into the house, feeling the weight of my decision settle on my shoulders, but I didn't hesitate. This was right. Monday came, and I threw myself into my new job at Marshall & Brooks Financial. I focused on my work, trying not to think about the confrontation that I knew was coming. I tried not to think about how, in just a few short days, my father and Linda would return from their vacation and find the locks changed, their lives packed up, their plans dismantled. I had no illusions about the coming storm. I knew what they would say, I knew how Linda would react, and I was ready. 2 weeks passed, and I had settled into my new routine. My work was going well, and I was slowly making new friends. My colleagues were friendly and welcoming. Sarah from the risk assessment team had already taken me out to lunch, and I was feeling good about the direction my life was going. I even managed to shake off the dread of what awaited me at home, even if it was only for a little while. But when I pulled into the driveway on that Friday afternoon, I knew something had changed. The atmosphere in the air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the tension before I even saw them. There they were, Dad, looking nervous, Linda, red-faced and furious, and Sophie standing off to the side with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was the enemy. They had just returned from their vacation, and the suitcases were still in their rental car. I could see the anger in Linda's eyes before she even spoke. She started screaming before I even had the chance to get out of my car. "How dare you change our locks? How dare you lock us out of our own house?" Her voice was shrill, and I could see the fury building in her posture. She was ready to explode. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond immediately. I simply walked past them, unlocked the door with the new keys, and stepped inside, leaving them standing there, seething. Linda followed me into the house, still yelling, her face red with rage. "We're calling the police! This is breaking and entering! This is our house!" I stopped in the doorway and turned to face them, my voice steady. "No, Linda, it's not your house. It never was." She blinked, her face faltering for a moment. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Tell her, Dad. Tell her she's lying." Dad didn't meet anyone's eyes. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping. He knew what was coming, and there was no denying the truth now. "She's telling the truth," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house, it was always hers." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I could see the realization sinking in slowly but surely. Linda's face transformed from fury to something more calculating, like she was trying to find a way to salvage something from this mess. "Oh, Carol, sweetheart," she said, forcing a laugh. "You didn't think I was serious on the phone, did you? I was just joking. You know how I can get sometimes. All that sun, the cocktails, they went to my head. I wasn't buying it. Not for a second." "Stop it," I said quietly. She didn't stop, though. She kept going, her tone shifting as she moved closer, her arms outstretched like she was going to hug me. "We're family, remember? All those nice times we had, the book club meetings, the holiday dinners. We can have that again." I shook my head. "No, Linda, we can't." Her smile faltered for just a second, and I could see the desperation creeping into her eyes. But I wasn't backing down. Dad, ever the peacemaker, jumped in, his voice thick with emotion. "Princess, I'm so sorry. I know I handled this all wrong, but I love you. You're my daughter. Please, can't we work this out?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The father who had abandoned me, who had let Linda take over my life, and now, who had let her try to take what was mine. "Work this out?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. "How do you expect to work this out? You lied to your wife about owning my house. You let her try to erase everything my mom worked for, and you said nothing." Linda turned back to me, trying again, but her tone was losing the charm it had once had. "We can all live here together," she said, her voice strained. "We'll pay rent, okay? We can work this out." I shook my head. "No, this is my house. take your things from the garage and leave. And that's exactly what they did. They spent hours packing, loading everything into their rental car, and I stood by, watching, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. By the time the last box was loaded into the car, I was done with the lies, done with their manipulation, and ready to finally start taking control of my life again. After the conversation with Dad in the office, the reality of what he said settled heavily in my chest. I had been living under the assumption that this house, my mother's house, was always going to be mine. The house my mother had bought long before Dad entered the picture. The house she made sure I'd always have when she was gone. But now, I was hearing that it wasn't mine at all. It belonged to him. And the worst part? He had lied to Linda about it, allowing her to believe she owned it. The tension that evening was suffocating. At dinner, the air felt thick with unspoken words. Linda no longer greeted me with her usual warm smiles. The woman who had once made me feel included, who baked my favorite lasagna, and tried to make me feel like I was part of their new family, now stared at me with cold eyes, as though I was an inconvenience. Dad, meanwhile, kept shooting me these pleading looks, silently begging me to play along, to keep quiet just a little longer. But I couldn't. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine anymore. I was trapped in a house I thought was mine, with people who didn't care about me. All of their warmth, their kindness, had been an act. Linda had wanted to make it seem like we were family, but when the truth came to light, I realized she never truly saw me as one of her own. The next morning, I was making coffee when Linda cornered me in the kitchen. She was still in her robe, her hair uncombed, but her eyes were sharp. There was no warmth left in her tone. "Carol," she said, leaning against the counter, "I think we need to talk about your plans." "My plans?" I asked, confusion mixing with the bitterness in my stomach. "Yes," she continued, her words casual but deliberate. "When are you planning to look for your own place? You've got your job now. You're a grown woman. It's time to start thinking about moving out." I took a slow sip of my coffee, trying to keep my composure. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I've talked to Dad about staying here for now. He's fine with it." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen without saying another word. The next few weeks were unbearable. The house, which had once felt like home, now felt like a battleground. Linda's passive-aggressive behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. She would deliberately wash my clothes with others, making sure they bled onto my white shirts. She'd cook meals for everyone, but always made just enough for 3, acting surprised when I showed up to the table. When I tried to watch TV in the living room, she would come in, suddenly needing to vacuum the same area I was sitting in. It was all deliberate. It was her way of showing me that I no longer had a place here. Sophie, my half-sister, who had once looked up to me, began treating me the same way Linda did. She'd roll her eyes when I entered a room and call me that girl when she talked to her friends. Everything was shifting, and I could feel myself being pushed out of my own life. Despite all of this, my career was beginning to take off. I had accepted a job at Marshall & Brooks Financial, and the transition was going well. I had made new friends at work, and my colleagues were welcoming. It was the one bright spot in the chaos of my personal life. One of my colleagues, Sarah, from the risk assessment team, even took me to lunch to welcome me. It was nice to have something normal, something positive to focus on. But coming home was always uncomfortable. I would walk through the door and immediately feel the tension in the air. Linda and Dad would exchange looks as if they were plotting something. They'd hurry to shove papers into drawers, trying to cover up their discomfort with fake smiles. But it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the cracks in our family dynamic. Then, one Saturday morning, everything changed. I woke up to an unusually quiet house. No sound of Linda bustling around the kitchen. No noise from Sophie's room. No TV blaring in the living room. It felt wrong. The silence was thick, like the calm before a storm. I checked every room, but everything was empty. The kitchen was spotless, unused since the night before. The living room was perfectly arranged, just as Linda liked it. Sophie's boots, which usually cluttered the entryway, were nowhere to be found. Even Dad's car was gone. I tried calling Dad first, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Still nothing. My stomach tightened with anxiety. Then I called Linda. She picked up on the 4th ring, but her tone was different, sharp. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice dripping with hostility. I was taken aback. I woke up, and the house is empty, I said, trying to stay calm. Where is everyone? There was a pause. Then she laughed, a cold, mean laugh that sent a chill down my spine. Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives. First-class flights, luxury resorts, the works. We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you tagging along and expecting us to pay for you too. Not that you'd know anything about paying for things yourself. The anger rose in me so fast I could barely speak. You're in the Maldives, and you didn't tell me. This is my house. I was yelling now, my voice trembling with fury. How could you do this to me? Linda cut me off, her words venomous. You're nothing but a lazy freeloader, living in our house like you own the place. Your dad might put up with you, but I'm done. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a grown woman living here, eating our food, using our utilities? I was shaking, but not from fear anymore. This wasn't just betrayal. It was cruelty. I'm not your problem, she continued, and neither is your father. He agrees with me, but he's too weak to tell you. The line went dead. I stood there, paralyzed with shock. I had tried to be understanding. I had tried to make it work. But this was too much. I had been living in my mother's house, and they had been treating me like I was the intruder. Now, they were vacationing in the Maldives, leaving me behind without a care. But that was it. Enough was enough. I blocked their numbers on my phone, my hands still trembling from the shock. But the anger began to fuel me. I started packing their things. Linda's expensive clothes, Sophie's school things, Dad's golf clubs. All of it went into boxes. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't going to be treated like this. By Sunday morning, I had everything packed. I called a 24-hour locksmith to change the locks on the doors. It was expensive, but it was worth every penny. When the locks were replaced, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They had taken everything from me, but now I was taking back control. 2 weeks later, they returned from their vacation, and they were about to realize just how much they had underestimated me. I had prepared myself for the moment they would return. I knew it would be ugly, but it was necessary. As the car pulled into the driveway, I stood by the window, watching them drag their luggage from the rental car. Dad looked nervous, like he already knew the storm was coming. Linda, on the other hand, looked furious, her face twisted in anger even before she stepped inside. Sophie was hanging back, watching the scene unfold like it was just another show. I walked to the door and unlocked it, deliberately taking my time. When they reached the front porch, Linda was the first to speak, her voice a shrill scream before I could even get out of the doorway. "How dare you change our locks?" she yelled, her face red with fury. "How dare you lock us out of our own house?" I didn't flinch. I stepped aside, letting them in. "It's not your house, Linda. It never was. This house belongs to me. It was my mother's house, and she left it to me." Linda's face went from rage to disbelief and then quickly to something darker, calculation. She looked at Dad, who was standing behind her looking defeated. "Tell her she's lying," Linda demanded, her voice cracking. "Tell her this is our house." Dad wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Instead, he just shrugged, his shoulders sagging. "She's telling the truth. The house was always hers." For the first time, I saw Linda's entire demeanor change. Her fake smile reappeared, but it was strained, like it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, Carol, sweetheart," she said in that sickly sweet tone. "You didn't think I was serious on the phone, did you? I was just joking. You know how I can get sometimes. All that sun, those tropical cocktails. It went to my head. I wasn't buying it." "Stop it," I said coldly. "You're not fooling me." Dad spoke up then, his voice trembling with emotion. "Princess, I'm sorry. I know I handled this all wrong, but I love you. You're my daughter. Please, can't we work this out?" I looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time in years. The man who had abandoned me, lied about my house, and watched his wife try to erase my mother's legacy. "Work what out, Dad?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. "The fact that you lied about everything? That you let her believe this was hers?" Linda's smile faltered. "Carol, we can all live here together. We'll pay rent, of course." "No," I said firmly. "We can't. Your things are in the garage. Take them and leave." She exploded in anger, but I didn't care. It was over. I had taken my life back. As I stood there watching them leave, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. After the phone call with Linda, I felt a deep simmering rage. This wasn't just about her. This was about my entire life. They had been treating me like I was invisible for years, and now they had the audacity to call me a freeloader in my own home. I wasn't going to let them take this away from me. This house was my mother's legacy, and I would defend it, no matter what. I blocked their numbers. My hands shook as I did it, but the anger was outweighing the fear. I couldn't let them continue manipulating me. It was clear that they saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, and it was time to stand up for myself. For the next few days, I focused on gathering their things. It wasn't just about packing up their belongings, it was about reclaiming my space. Linda's things, Sophie's toys, and Dad's clothes, all of it was packed up and stored in the garage. I didn't care about their comfort anymore. They had crossed a line, and now I was taking back control. I called a locksmith to replace the locks, and when they arrived, I watched them install new locks on all the doors. It cost me, but every penny felt worth it. When I handed the locksmith my card, there was a strange satisfaction in knowing that I had taken charge of my own life again. 2 weeks later, I saw them at the door. Dad, Linda, and Sophie had returned from their vacation, and their faces twisted in disbelief as they stood outside, bags in hand. Linda screamed before I even opened the door. "How dare you change the locks?" she shouted. "This is our house!" I walked past them without saying a word and unlocked the door. When Linda tried to make nice, her false smile was obvious. "You didn't think I was serious on the phone, did you?" she asked, her voice dripping with insincerity. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I stood my ground. "This isn't your house." "It never was," I told her firmly. "It belongs to me. And now I want you gone." The truth hit her like a truck, but she tried to keep up the charade. Sophie cried. Dad looked defeated. But this time, I didn't flinch. I wasn't their doormat anymore. As they packed their things, I realized how much better my life would be without them in it. I closed the door behind them, and for the first time in years, I felt free. This house, this life, was mine now, and I was finally going to make it my own.